Welcome to the Special Education Essentials for Parents and Families podcast with your host, David Tollner. In each episode, we'll have guests who are professionals in the special education and disability services industry who support children with special needs. The law is complex, and this podcast does not cover all situations, legal responsibilities, or variations in different circumstances. This podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only, and nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal advice. The views expressed in this podcast may not be those of the host or the firm. We are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. This podcast is not intended to replace legal advice. You can find this show on all the major platforms including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, TollnerLawOffices.com. Now, here's the host of Special Education Essentials for Parents and Families, David Tollner.
Yes, welcome everyone to a special episode, I think, because it's the last episode in the first season of Special Education Essentials. If any of you have followed us from the beginning, I hope it's been a good use of your time to join us and learn about IEPs and various programs in your area that might benefit your child and how to improve your child's IEP so that the outcomes for your child academically, emotionally, socially are better, right? That's what we want to see is progress. Today, we're going to do things a little differently. I do not have someone to introduce to you today, someone to interview about their program or dyslexia or any of the other things we've talked about over this season. Today, I want to approach an IEP from a different perspective, right? So far, everything we've talked about has been geared toward parents with children that are already in the process or the IEP system, right? They have an IEP. It's very much about what's available, what options are there, and then how to improve the IEP outcomes, as we were talking about, and particularly the first three episodes focused on that. So that means that the population I'm missing, who may or may not be listening to this podcast, are those parents who have kids that are struggling but are not yet on IEPs, right? They aren't in the system yet. And very many of them need to be, right? We can anticipate far better outcomes if they have IEPs, because that is the entire intent of the law. So I'm going to speak to those parents. If you have an IEP already, you've listened to this podcast, you've gotten hopefully something out of it, and you've gone through the child find process, the initial assessments, and your child has been found eligible and is on an IEP, this is probably not the episode for you. We will be talking at the end about some things that could be valuable, which is how to give notice if you want to provide a private service for your child and you want the district to pay for it. But for the most part, this episode is going to be for parents who do not yet have their children on IEPs, but recognize something isn't going well in school. So let's talk about that, right? So if you're listening to this and you've got a child in school, anywhere from preschool all the way up through a senior in high school, and it isn't going well, very little progress is being made. Maybe there's such anxiety that your child is refusing to go to school often, right? That child can be found eligible for an IEP. If your child has particularly poor grades, or you know that there's a learning disability, but there's been no diagnosis, and there's a huge struggle, let's say, in math, right, to just get off the ground. Math facts are very, very hard. Math fluency is very, very poor, right? Your child may have a learning disability in math. If your child cannot comprehend reading, right, or reads very in a stunted fashion and it doesn't really struggles to read words across the page, your child may have dyslexia, right? And that's a learning disability that would find that student eligible for an IEP. So if you're a parent out there that's listening to this and you have a child that's miserable in school, doing very poorly, and you keep getting the message from the district things are going well, but as you sit down to work with your child at home in the evenings, they're just not grasping month after month, if not year after year, any of the academic concepts that you're trying to get through to them, and that the teachers at school are also struggling, then it's very, very, very likely in those situations that your child should be on an IEP. Now, that is not something that the school is necessarily going to determine for you. You're going to have to push that. So let's talk about that. And that is the purpose of this IEP, how to get your child on an IEP if you think that things are not going well and that they could use special services, right? So to set the stage for all that, I want to start with the very basic, the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, right? That's what this is all stemming from, which is a federal law that first came out in the 70s and has had various iterations, improvements, and some not so, some changes that were not improvements from our perspective over the years. And now we this federal law that is mirrored by California and many other states, right? So the federal law is going to control no matter what state you live in, but you're also very likely to have state laws that are very close to the IDEA. And that is because if the Congress decides to do away with the IDEA, it doesn't mean that the laws change for you depending upon what state you're in. And that law basically says this, that if your child is eligible for an IEP, an individual education plan, because they have some learning disability, and there's 13 different categories, right? Autism, obviously mental health issues, ID, intellectual disability, dyslexia, all the learning disabilities, reading, writing, math, and there's many more, TBI, traumatic brain injury, right? And then there's this other health impairment, which is sort of a catch-all for many different other things, right? But the key is your child really cannot learn and progress in school without supports, right? And so the law, which I love because I think it's just it's one of the laws that were made back in the day when great laws were enacted by Congress, and they really did great things. And this is one, because it says to everybody, if you have a learning disability, we're not going to throw you away. If you have autism, we don't throw you away. We do what we can for you, right? We have to, and that means we have to find a way to drive progress in all of your deficit areas if you're on an IEP, and that is contrary to the way that we used to treat kids that couldn't learn in a classic, teacher in front of 30 kids environment, which doesn't really serve many of our students. But that was the way we did things. That's the way our culture drove education. And it doesn't work for a lot of kids. And so instead of what we used to do, which was basically put those kids in schools that did very little for them, expected very little of them, and then, of course, they wouldn't graduate with a diploma. And as a culture and as a society, we would pay for all of that well down the road, right? It was very short-sighted the way we used to play that. Now we're not so short-sighted. We have laws that say we're going to meet those kids where they are, drive progress for those kids so that they have an opportunity to be successful professionally, et cetera, well after school. So the idea of the IDEA is to establish these eligibility categories. And if you're eligible to have these kids on an IEP so that their education can be individualized, which is great. And then the law says that if you're on an IEP, that there must be meaningful progress, quote unquote, meaningful progress on the goals that are established as part of that IEP. and that's meaningful progress in accordance with the circumstances of that child's disabilities. And that's an important addition that is relatively new, actually. It used to be meaningful progress meant any progress, de minimis progress, anything that indicated some progress was enough. And a lot of districts were able with that law to do very little and get away with it. Okay, now the progress has to be sufficient and in accordance with the circumstances of the disability, which means theoretically, and the easiest way to talk about it, I think, is if there's a student with intellectual disability, a very low IQ, which means cognitive difficulties in understanding concepts, right? Academic concepts. There's sometimes, if it's a very, very low cognitive ability, a little bit of progress is all that can be expected. And that is why in accordance with the circumstances of the disability is in there, because we can't hold districts to standards that are impossible, right? And that makes sense to me. However, unfortunately, or fortunately, what it also means is just because the school district isn't creating progress doesn't mean progress isn't possible. So very often what we have to do is if there's no progress, the district's response is, well, it's because they have a certain syndrome or because they have ID or the cognitive abilities are very low. We just can't do anything with that. It's not our fault. We're doing everything we can. Progress just isn't possible, right? But then we find a kid who's not making progress. We hear that from the district and we put them in a program that is designed for them. And we see progress shoot up, right? Here's the graph for many years at a school district, right? And this is not because they're not trying, but they just don't have the tools in many cases. And so here's the graph over many years progress, maybe even a little bit up, right? There's de minimis progress over time. But then we take a child and we put them in a school designed for their disability, and progress graph, if you graph all the data points, looks like this, right? So now we know when that happens that the circumstances of that disability are such that if we actually put them in the right programming, we can see this. And that's very, very important. So we don't ever look at de minimis progress or no progress and think to ourselves, it's because of the disability. We always are looking for, okay, now what is available out there, right? In terms of science-based, hopefully science-based programming that is designed for that disability. What is available out there that is going to take a no progress or very little progress student and create a high progress student? And if we can do that, and sometimes it takes a few months, it's a crapshoot. We say, you know what, we don't know. We're going to try this program. And if it doesn't work, we're really going to struggle to get the district to reimburse because it turns out they were doing everything they could after all. But most often what happens is when we find the right program, we put them in it, we see this versus this, and now we've established, right, that the circumstances of that child's disability are such that in the right programming, they can make great progress. That is a great case for district reimbursement for the cost of that program, right? So, but, some of that maybe falls outside of where I want to go with this, but that's the overlay, right? Kids not doing well in school, poor grades, can't get the concepts, can't sit still, so no engagement with instruction, depression and anxiety around school that literally leads to no school at all because they just can't get themselves to go. Maybe bullying has become such a daily occurrence in their lives. The last thing they want to do is get on a bus and go to school or get dropped off there, and they just won't get out of the car or won't get out of bed. Right? Day after day after day after day. Those are all the kinds of kids that we can serve with an IEP. All right. So now you've got the basics. So, right. So you've got a kid that's not doing well. You know that they need to make meaningful progress or the law demands that they do, and yours is not. So now what do? There is a concept in the law called child find. This is right straight from the IDEA. And it basically means it is the district's obligation not just to wait for parents to come to them, but to actively find the kids that need the extra help. And it's a law that is disregarded a lot, right? It's just one of those laws that, districts say, all right, I know we're supposed to find these kids, but we're not going to do that. In fact, we're going to look the other way a lot. And even though the signs are very, very obvious that they need our help, very many districts will wait until they have to do something. I think I said this in one of the earlier episodes. School districts, many of them, not all of them, some of them are wonderful, and certainly not all of them in any one district. But it feels like districts operate like insurance companies, right? Say no, no, no until you absolutely have to say yes. And because of that, we need to make them say yes a lot, right? And sometimes it just is us pointing out that they're breaking the law, and that can be very expensive if they don't say yes. And very often, because school administrators and teachers are all very smart, all or most very educated, so they get what they're not doing, but they very often have to be told what they're not doing before we get much out of them. But the point is, there's this child find concept. So they're supposed to go find your kid, but they don't. So what you need to do in that situation, your child is not doing well. There hasn't been very much progress over time. And I'm talking about years in some cases. If it's just weeks or months, there's no progress. You don't get much out of that. You complain about it. You see if they can support. But if that extends, now you're looking at very little progress. And the gap between your child, not sure how I do that. But the gap between your child and his peers is growing as your child passes from year to year in school. That's a sign your child needs help, right? And it's very much a sign that your child could be on an IEP and be getting that help, literally daily, from the school district your child is in. All right. So one of the ways to get a district to put your child on an IEP is to ask them. And you have to do it in writing. Send them an email. All right. My child's not doing well. They haven't made progress in math in 2 years. I'm really worried, or whatever the situation is. Describe that situation and say, please do a comprehensive psych ed assessment on my child. Now, when they get that, it applies pressure, because legally, if there's any good reason, right, their obligation again is to go find that kid. Now in writing is a request for them to assess, which is to really go find that kid. And if they say no, they're opening themselves up to a significant legal violation, the kind of violation of somebody like me, an attorney, a special ed attorney, loves, right? I see that violation and I'm writing my student's ticket for whatever specialty school, because the one thing this district can't do is look the other way, intentionally look the other way, and they often do. And so when a parent writes an email and says, please assess my child for an IEP, and they say, no, we don't see the signs of it, and the signs of it are everywhere, and this happens more often than you think, that is such a key violation that somebody like me takes great advantage of it. All right. But let's say now they assess, as they should. Now you've got this report. They assess your child, right? They pull them out of class for over the course of a number of hours. It's not that strenuous or, evasive. It's just something that has to happen, right? You've got to find the time in a school day. It doesn't take more than a few weeks generally once they dig in. And great. Now at the end of that, you've got this 25 to 45 page report that tells you quite a bit, if it's done well, about your child and how they learn. All right. And now at the end of that process, you have this meeting and they walk through. The district has a decision to make, and that is to find your child eligible for an IEP or not. So here's another violation point, if you will, right? The first one being, no, we're not even going to assess. Great. If they should have, we win. Second is they do an assessment. They should find eligibility, but they don't. Somebody like me looks at that and says, great, that's a great violation. That's an opportunity, right, to get something very valuable, because the district did what they were supposed to do on the assessment side, but then they went through that whole process, should have found eligibility, and did not, refused it to this parent and this student. So that we take advantage of. But then if it goes well and they should have been found eligible and the district finds them eligible, then you're done, right? Then you're on an IEP. So that's the process you need to go through. If your child's not doing well in school, the first thing you do, and you don't have to wait forever to do this, but as soon as it's clear progress isn't being made, right? Or very little progress is being made over time, or that there's these new things that are happening that are very unusual, school refusal, et cetera, because of either outside or school-based forces, whatever is going on, put in writing a request for an assessment. Number one, if they refuse and shouldn't, and this goes on, and you ask again and they refuse again, and you happen to contact somebody like me, doesn't need to be me or my firm, any special ed attorney or even an advocate can run you through through much of this. Well, then what you've got is an opportunity because the district dropped the ball in a very significant way. Okay. But what you're hoping happens is that it starts the process to put your child on an IEP, right? At which point we go back to the first 3 episodes of this series and you learn about, okay, how do you improve your child's IEP? How do you get ready? What do you ask for? What do you do if you don't get what you ask for, right? Those are all things we talk about in the first 3 episodes that you should review if you haven't seen them. Or you should review if you're getting into this process, you want an IEP, now you've got one. Now you've got to know how to improve that IEP, and you should go back and listen to the first 3 episodes of this series. All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about an IEE, an independent educational evaluation. Now you've asked for an assessment. The district did their assessment, let's say, and let's start with the district refuses to do an assessment. So you go hire a private assessor. You say, you know what, the district's wrong. I know my child's eligible for an IEP, so I'm going to hire somebody, a neuropsych, right, who does this kind of educational testing, and I'm going to see if they agree my child belongs on an IEP. Most neuropsychs that do this for parents are very child-oriented, right? They want what's best for their clients or their patients in that regard. And if this student should be on an IEP, they will not only write a report that indicates that, but they'll go to the meeting, right? Because then what you do is you have this report, and this report says my child has dyslexia and ADHD and is on the spectrum level 1 and should be on an IEP, right? Because there's ed impact. That's the other thing, is that what's going on with your child, their disability has to have an educational impact. But of course, you're not there if there isn't an educational impact in most cases. Districts will sometimes say not eligible because there's no ed impact, but that's falls very often quite flat because the whole point of the assessment and the whole point of everything is that something wasn't going well. And there are very often examples where, all right, there really was no ed impact. What was going well wasn't a disability that fell under one of the 13 categories potentially, or the kids getting straight A's. The fact that they miss a few days of school a month just isn't enough. So there are those scenarios where if your kid's getting straight A's and still there are some issues, chances of eligibility are less likely. Still possible depending upon what the disability is and how intense it can be at times, even if the kid is somehow fighting through it and getting good grades. But most of the time what we're talking about is poor grades, right? Or you're at the years in elementary school and grades are so subjective, they really don't mean anything. And what we're really looking at is, what does the state testing show? Is there progress year over year, right? Because grades are not very helpful, particularly when school districts are designed to pass kids on year after year after year and get them through the system. All right. So you could, if the district says we're not going to assess, you go get your own assessment, you bring it to them, you ask for an IEP or a meeting at that stage, and we still call it an IEP even though the kid's not on an IEP yet. And then your assessor talks to the district and says, here's why I think this child should be on an IEP. Most often that works because what the district needed was that impetus, that momentum, because they didn't want to do it themselves. Now they'll say, all right, we're going to do our own testing, theoretically. Every once in a while, they'll say, okay, we'll accept that and put Johnny on an IEP, right? That's great. Either one of those is great. We love for them just to accept our assessor's report, but very often they don't. They want their own people to understand Johnny and what he needs. And so they're going to do their own testing. But it's very hard for them to say no when a neuropsych, right, somebody with a PhD, and most of the people that we use and that you would use have that, come in and say, yeah, no, sorry, guys, this kid belongs on an IEP. Very difficult for the school to say no. They often do. Again, an opportunity for someone like me, and an opportunity for you if you're listening to this as a parent and you go, oh my God, that's exactly what the district did to us. Somehow you have to change your thinking, and instead of being, and you certainly can be upset, but what they've given you is a phenomenal opportunity. We take advantage of those opportunities all the time because that's our job. It's what we're paid for, is to see where the violations are and then take advantage of them. And very often it becomes a very costly violation for the district, as you can imagine, because the specialty schools, many of which we saw in, through many episodes in this series, can be expensive, right? But they're very good. And they are designed sometimes, or hopefully they're designed for the children that are there and the students that are there. And in most cases, we see phenomenal progress where we saw very little, if any, before. All right. So let's say they did a child fine. They assessed them. The school district assessed, and they didn't find eligibility. Now you go and you ask for an IEE, an independent educational evaluation. You do it in writing. And the law says all you need to say is that you disagree with their last assessment, and you describe it by the date of the report, or the date of the IEP meeting where they didn't find eligibility, and so you didn't get your child on an IEP. You send that in to the school psychologist or the principal or the SPED director in the district, and you wait for them to respond. Very often, they will say yes. And the only reason they say yes, they used to many years ago say no all the time, but very often they say yes because they've done the math on it year after year, and they realize that saying no requires, by law, them to hire counsel and to file against the parents to establish at a administrative hearing that the assessment that they did was acceptable. It was appropriate. They did all the things they were supposed to do, interviewed all the people they were supposed to interview, and their results were acceptable, and that's it, right? Not on the question of eligibility. That won't come up at that hearing. It is just, did they do an acceptable job, an appropriate job when they assessed? Very often the answer is no, so they say yes to an IEE request. And very often, even if they did a great job, they will say yes to an IEE request only because it's much cheaper for them to do it than to hire counsel to fight you. Most IEEs cost about $7,500. Why say no to all of them and spend $15,000 to say no when you can say yes to more of them? That said, also, very, very, very often we see district assessments that have significant errors, that if they do file against the parents, our advice will be, all right, let's go beat them there. Because if we can beat them with an IEE on an IEE case because their assessment was so bad, now we've established that everything that they've done after that, even if they found eligible for an IEP, but the assessment was poor, the IEP is suspect because it's based on a bad assessment. So when we see bad assessments, and we see a lot of them, it is an opportunity once again. All right. And that's what this is just the way that I want parents to be thinking about these violations. Sometimes when they're significant enough, they become opportunities. All right. So now you've got this IEE that you can go get that can help you through various stages of this process, right? We had Dr. Pratt on earlier. Here's somebody who's a perfect example of an IEE assessor, right? And it's not only the child find piece, getting your child on an IEP, but if the school is the child's been on an IEP for 5 years and nothing good is happening. Somebody like Dr. Pratt, and there are many others, Dr. Holowicki, I think, was on as well. Somebody like that can help find the right placement and get the district to pay for a placement that is actually going to drive meaningful progress for your child. All right. So the IE piece can be very important. So now, how does that? Now your child's on an IEP, just so you give you a better background or an understanding of what happens next, because most of the listeners will not have a child on an IEP for this episode. All right. So now you've got your IEP, but progress still isn't happening, right? So what is the IEP made of? What are you getting into when you ask for an IEP? The thing that you're getting into is an understanding of your child's learning disabilities, clearly, but also what should happen at that IEP is that assessment or assessments, if you have an IE or if you don't, in those assessments are going to be all of the deficit areas your child is dealing with, whether or not they're related to the eligibility category that the district adopts as the primary eligibility for your child to be on an IEP. Even if the eligibility category is, let's say your child's on an IEP for dyslexia, so SLD, specific learning disability, but they also have a social deficit, right? And totally unrelated in many respects to dyslexia, but he's not on the IEP for social deficits. He's on the IEP for dyslexia, but the assessment has uncovered these social deficits that need support. That is a deficit area, even though it's not related to the eligibility category that your child should have a goal in, right? So here's the key to an IEP. Every deficit area needs a goal. I talk about this in the first 3 episodes. So the IEP then is this understanding of these disabilities, this establishing baselines for all these deficit areas, establishing what the deficit areas are, establishing baselines, where is the child in that particular skill, and then drafting a goal for each of those deficit areas. And then at the end of the IEP, the way the process works is the district makes an offer of services designed to create meaningful progress on each of those goals. Okay? And that's the system. That's the process that everybody goes through. That's the thinking. We identified the disability. We identify the deficit areas with the assessments. We create a goal for each deficit area, and the school's obligation is to provide services and supports and placements that is designed to move progress on each of those goals. All right. That's the big picture. That's what you're after when you're at an IEP, is those supports and services and placements designed to drive progress in your students' deficit areas. All right. I'm hoping that makes sense. It's easy for, it makes sense to me. Of course, I've been doing this for so long, but hopefully if you're a parent out there listening that doesn't understand the IEP process, this is a good introduction to it and how to get your child on an IEP. And then I really encourage you to listen to the first 3 episodes of this series. All right. So I think we're almost done. How are we doing on time? Perfect. All right. There's one more concept. Your child's been on an IEP. I don't think I talk about it very much in any of the previous episodes. So I wanted to touch on it here in the last episode of the series of this season. And that is, your child's been on an IEP for a very long time. Very little progress has been made. You find a specialty school, many of which we've interviewed over the course of this season, and you want to put your child there at public expense, right? And because they haven't done what they needed to do by law, they haven't driven meaningful progress in accordance with your child's disability circumstances, and you're tired of that. You can't deal with that anymore. You found a school that's perfect for Johnny and you want to put him there, and you want the district to pay for it. Or your child has dyslexia, they're not making any progress on that, and you want the district to pay for Barton or Lindenwood Bell or any Wilson program, anybody or anything that is going to drive progress in a deficit area the district has ignored or largely ignored, or they've put your child in front of a computer program for 5 hours a week that does absolutely nothing. Okay, so they use Read 180. That's their dyslexia program, which is a joke. All right. So now you've got that, and so you want the district to pay for something because you need to add something to your child, either a whole new placement or an outside support. Do not start paying for that or start that support without first giving notice of unilateral placement at public expense. It's very simple. It's a simple email, principal, school psychologist, sped director, doesn't matter, that says you're going to be providing this support that they're not providing to drive progress in an area they're not driving progress in. And you're going to do it, quote unquote, at public expense, which tells them you're going to be looking for them for reimbursement of the expense associated with that service. Okay. You send that email out in one of two ways, or you send that email out 2 full weeks before you start that service. The only option available to you under these scenarios is at an IEP. If you make that announcement on recording, because you're recording everything, if you listen to this podcast at all, you're recording everything at an IEP. And at the end of the IEP, you say, I'm giving you notice of unilateral placement of public expense right now for X service. That's good. You can start that service the next day. But if you don't give that notice at an IEP, you have to give it in writing, and then you have to wait business days, right? So 2 full weeks. And if there's a holiday in there, add an extra day. That way you hold open at least your opportunity to get reimbursed by the school district for that service or placement. All right? So I'm hoping that the combination of that sort of overlay and that general understanding of an IEP and how to get your child into an IEP so they can start to get those special services and supports or even a special placement is helpful. Once your child is in an IEP, go back and listen, if you would, to the first 3 episodes that talks about how to improve that IEP and make sure your child makes progress with it and how you can drive progress through an IEP, right? How to prepare and what to say and those kinds of things. All right. So hopefully, if you've listened to this podcast over the course of many, many weeks now, you've been able to glean some things that are very helpful for you. That is my hope for this podcast overall. All right. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. I hope you've gotten something out of this. We'll be back next season in a few months, I'm sure, as we talk to more people involved in this industry so that you can have as good an understanding of how to improve your child's progress at school, particularly if they have a learning disability. All right. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you very much for listening.
You've been tuning in to the Special Education Essentials for Parents and Families podcast with your host, David Tollner. This podcast is not intended as legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. Please talk to your legal counsel about your own situation. You can find this show on all the major platforms, including YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Apple Podcast, Spotify, and on our website, tollnerlawoffices.com. Thank you for your positive reviews, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others.